Hey, John.
Hey Rob, so you made it. You had someone coming to your house to do something, right? But it was not clear. Oh, for your infestation, right? You have, is it opossums you have inside your
Possums,
house?
yeah, possum pups.
Yeah.
Caught 4 of them so far.
Wow. That's, I mean, I feel bad that you have this organism you don't want, but it's kind of an interesting idea. I mean, possums are kind of cute.
I've always liked possums.
Just not under your sink, right?
What's that?
Just not under your sink.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oh, and I see Valerie is here, so that's great. So Valerie, we were Valerie Bentz, right? So I assume V Bentz is, yeah, Valerie, great. So you're muted currently, Valerie, but in a minute, I'm going to ask if you want to maybe discuss the issue that we spoke about, and you can talk to the group about that.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well, thank you everybody for showing up for this meeting of Carpinteria Birdwatchers for July 16th, 2020. The official topic for today is Peeps, or Peeps and Friends, because there weren't that many peeps I could talk about, so I expanded the category a little bit. So it's little shorebirds, including peeps, inclusive of peeps. So we're going to talk about the small shorebirds that you can see in Santa Barbara County. We'll get to that in just a minute. Just a few quick sort of top of the meeting announcements. By default, when you join, your mic is muted, and we ask that you keep yourself muted if you're not actually talking, just because it's distracting for the people who are talking, if they're always hearing, all the background noises from all the participants. But do unmute yourself and chime in if you have questions or you have comments. If I say something that you know to be incorrect, I really appreciate it if you can interrupt and let me know, because I am prone to saying things that are incorrect, and it's always nice if I can find out at the time rather than later when I'm rewatching the video and go, oh my gosh, why didn't anyone say that I said this terribly stupid thing? That's how we normally handle it. If you have something to say, there's a hand raise feature in Zoom that you can use to kind of indicate that you have something to say. You can also wave your hand in front of the camera, and if you're lucky, we'll see you waving your hand and we'll know you want to talk. You can also just unmute and chime in. We're pretty informal, and as long as everybody kind of looks after themselves, we don't have problems with people just jumping in and talking. Let's see. So the co-hosts for the meeting today are Tom Beland, who you see on screen, and Jenny Slaughter, who is appearing in Craig Murray's window, and he's also there kind of off to the side. Jenny is officially the co-host, though. Don't let Craig take over and start doing stuff. No, Craig can do whatever he wants. And also Laurel Luby, whose camera I think is off, but she's monitoring the YouTube live stream, which we also have. So just be aware, by the way, that we really like that people participate via Zoom and we can see you on your camera. We're also going out as a YouTube live stream, and that version of the meeting is available after the fact, so people might see it in the future. So just be aware that you're not just being seen by the people here, but you're potentially being seen by ones and twos of people in the future. We don't get a really big audience, but it's a thing that exists. And you can go back and watch the old meetings if you want to, which is fun. Okay, let's see. Any other announcements? I did want to mention, so I think for an upcoming meeting, I want to talk about the question of resuming our outings. So in the past, before COVID-19, Carpinteria Birdwatchers met in person at the Carpinteria Library, and we also went out in the field and had group birdwatching meetings, like once a month or so we'd go out. And for obvious reasons, we haven't been doing that. But at some point, we might start to think about resuming that. And as we get into sort of later in the year, we're planning for the local Christmas counts, and the organizers of the various local Christmas counts have been emailing back and forth, and I'm organizing the Carpinteria Christmas count. So we're kind of grappling with this issue of, how can group birding activities happen in a safe manner? So you can look forward to discussion of that maybe at a future meeting. I did go out this past weekend in one of the first group outings I've done in a while, which was with the pelagic trip that Island Packers ran out of Ventura last Sunday. This was their first thing they'd really done like that since the lockdown happened. And it was interesting, and I'd like to share my experiences from that. I'm going to wait for a future meeting. It takes a while for the eBird list from those outings to get prepared, and usually there's a lot of really cool photos to share, and So in a few weeks, maybe, or at some point in the future, when those lists are available, I'll maybe share about that outing, and then we can maybe also have a discussion around the question of the risks associating with birding with other people, and being mindful of that and trying to approach it in a way that keeps everyone safe. And I think, let's see. Oh, and there was one other quick announcement. Butterfly O'Shea, a valued member of Carpinteria Birdwatchers, forwarded a link to a seminar that will be happening next Thursday at 3 p.m. Pacific time, an online seminar from NOAA and the National Marine Sanctuaries Program. And it's titled Seabirds 101. And it's being put on by a person from Mass Audubon. And that sounded exciting to me. And since I think we're going to stick for now with a every 2 weeks schedule for the Carpinteria Birdwatchers meeting, that means we won't have a meeting next Thursday. But if you're really just desperate to have bird content on your Thursday, you could look into that. And there's a link to that in the description of the YouTube live stream video, and also on the blog post at carpwithoutcars.org for this meeting. Okay, so I think that's all my announcements. There were a couple of guests that we're going to have as part of the meeting today, which is fun for me. One is Nick Letheby, who's on screen is A0323759. So there's Nick. And Nick is an expert. I'm going to go into more detail about Nick and his background and why I asked him to be in the meeting in just a minute. But he's here as expert commentary on shorebirds as we're discussing the main topic of the meeting. But then before that, I also had a quick slot for a discussion from Valerie Bentz, who is also here. And is it Valerie? I'm sorry, maybe I know it starts with a V.
Yes, it's Valerie.
Yay.
Hi.
I haven't made a glaring error yet, so I'm good for the first 5 minutes. Anyway, Valerie is here to talk about a concern that she and others at the Carpinteria Valley Association had with a project to build a skate park in Carpinteria. So please, Valerie, share your concerns.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm a bird lover. From way back, I might have become an ornithologist in college. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you great.
Okay, except that it conflicted with the Shakespeare class, so I ended up an English major. But anyway, I'm now on the CVA, the Carpinteria Valley Association board, and we're becoming more interested in helping and working with Carpinteria toward lowering our carbon imprint overall because of the climate crisis. And also we're concerned with all aspects of the environment. And I recently, a little bit late in the project, found out there's a plan to build a skate park next to the city hall. And I have no objections to skate parks. I think they're really good for kids, and they give them some way to release their wonderful energies and all that, and even not opposed to having it there next to the city hall. However, when we looked at the plans, we saw that it intended to remove 58 eucalyptus trees in order to build parking spaces. So the plan is already approved. And so of course, we're not can't change anything about it. It's fully approved by the city council. However, we're hoping that maybe there could be some mitigation. A fellow from the skate park talked with some of us, and he seems open to mitigations. And one of them would be possibly changing the plans. The eucalyptus trees, some of you may be familiar with, they're right at, I guess it would be the south end or the east end of the city hall. And there's 2 rows of trees. One of them is the eucalypti.
Hey, Valerie, I can share my screen and actually give a view of that so people can see it, if that seems like
that would be great. Sure.
Yeah, let me do that. So this will take me just a second.
And we are feeling that those trees, while they aren't the most beautiful trees, they're providing a lot of a lot of oxygen and habitat, not only for birds, but other creatures that some of the birds depend on. So what I'm coming to you for is to see if you, as wonderful birders, may take some of your birding time and go out to those trees, and maybe at different times a day, and just see what birds live there, or use those trees for various of their activities. Oh, thank you so much, John.
Yeah,
You
so
can,
if I can indicate, so it's this row of trees here that we're talking about, right? This is Carpinteria Avenue, this is Tea Time, the golf course here, or the driving range. And there's a row of trees here that they're not planning on removing, but then this row of eucalyptus trees right here, this kind of row to the right of this little dirt driveway, that's what they were talking about taking out, right?
yes. So, we're just wondering, couldn't there be some mitigation so we could save those trees? And I also thought, as birders, maybe you could help at least cataloging or looking into what creatures are living there.
Yeah, I actually, after talking to you, I think, previously, I went and, let's see, is that gonna, can you still see my screen? I've taken it to another monitor.
I can see it, yes.
Okay, so, I actually went and birded there last week on July 9th. So if I've done this correctly, you can actually see my eBird list now.
No.
No? Okay, well, I'll stop the share and I'll do a new share maybe. Let's try this.
I think Rob may have had his hand up. Did you?
Yeah,
I was wondering if the Migratory Bird Act affects this in any way, especially in the Tamarisk Grove.
What is the
There's going to be
tamarisk?
an impact on the tamarisks, and we know that we get lots and lots of passing through warblers in there twice a year.
What is the tamarisk grove?
Oh, it's the row of trees to the east of the ones, the eucalyptus.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I don't know about that act. Sometimes when I read the reports from the city on various projects, I find them kind of writing off the CEQA, the California Environmental, by saying, well, this is a fill-in project. They use the word infill, because it's between developments, and therefore the CEQA Act doesn't have to be coming into play. And then somehow they write off the Coastal Commission in another way that I find to be a little bit too loose, but I think that's a good point, Rob, about the migratory birds, and they might need it. And one of the folks who had written about it also wondered, well, there was a letter in the Coastal Valley News about the butterfly migrations and whether the monarchs may not need it also.
Okay, well, I really, again, appreciate, Valerie, you bringing this to the group and talking about it. I'm jealous of my time because I want to talk about those peeps, but is there anything, anyone in particular you want people maybe to talk to, or do you have any recommendation for who you'd want them to contact if they shared your concerns?
Well, please contact me or Susan Milieu. Susan is with us, and she's on the CVA board. And I don't know, Susan, if you might want to add a few words to this.
Yeah, you're muted, Susan. I don't know if you're trying to talk yet. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, well, I'm not hearing anything from Susan. So is there anything else you wanted to add, Valerie, or are
No, but please, you see my email there, vbence@fielding.edu, but I also am valeriebence@gmail.com, or maybe through John or Tom, who I've also corresponded with you could connect with me. And I'd like to know, do you see birds there or whether wildlife, and is there any way you can help? Rob?
So if we bird there and develop eBird lists, we should let you know where to find those lists.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to, put your contact information on the blog post for this meeting so people who watch this in the future can find it that way.
Great, thank you so much. And now that I know about you, I'm going to be joining you as much as I can.
Oh, that's great.
I will have to leave early today because I have a Fielding University Zoom graduation event coming up. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And any other questions from anyone for Valerie? This would be a good time, just unmute and, no? Okay, well, thank you again. And
Thank
good
you.
luck. And I will certainly be birding there and recording what I find. And hope you can prevail on the people putting that project together to do a version of it that doesn't sacrifice so many of those trees. Okay, well then I am going to go on then to the main topic, which is Peeps. And let's see, I'm still sharing my screen. So with any luck, you are seeing my slideshow now with Peeps and Friends. Someone give me a thumbs up if you're seeing that. All right, yay. And I want to go ahead and introduce Nick. Nick Letheby, and I don't have a real good bio for you, Nick, but I know you work at Texas Instruments, I think, and you're involved in Internet of Things ecosystems, which is kind of a cool concept. Not the ecosystems I'm usually interested in, but kind of a neat thing. But the main reason I know about you is because you're an avid Santa Barbara County birder, and for those who obsess over eBird lists and county listing and rankings of people based on the rarities they see or report in the county, I think by pretty much anybody's estimation, you would be at or near the top of anybody's list for that category. Nick, are you, I'm not actually seeing your thumbnail because I've got the screen share going, but if you're present, can you go ahead and unmute and
yeah, I should be unmuted.
Okay, excellent. So you're there, which is great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Peeps. Before I jump into that, is there anything you wanted to mention, Nick, besides, in connection with my not very graceful introduction, or anything else about your participation here?
I'll just give a little bit more background. So I'm originally from the UK. I emigrated to the US when I was 26. And I actually started off in Oregon, then I migrated south to the Bay Area. Then about 20 years ago, I migrated from the Bay Area to Santa Barbara. We got pretty fed up with the traffic and stuff in the Bay Area. So I've been in Santa Barbara about 20 years now. And one thing I've always been pretty interested in is shorebirds. And especially when you live in the Pacific Northwest, that area is quite a bit better for shorebirds than Southern California, with the addition that you don't have the same number of kind of interesting eastern warblers and landbirds coming through, so you tend to focus a lot more on shorebirds. And so I got really even more into shorebirds living up in the Pacific Northwest, and also the Bay Area where I lived. I used to live near the bottom end of San Francisco Bay in somewhere called Milpitas. And that actually had a managed little shorebird lagoon while I was there next to the San Jose sewage works, which was, square mile or more of muddy lagoons. You couldn't really go in there officially, but I used to squeeze in under the fence and sneak in. And that was a pretty good shorebirding area too. So a lot of shorebirding before I came to Santa Barbara. I still look at shorebirds a lot down here, but unfortunately Santa Barbara may be the worst place on the coast of California for shorebirds. But
and is that just
you can still see plenty if you look.
Is that just because we don't have the right habitat for them?
Yeah, there's a lot of wetland problems in Santa Barbara County. Really pretty major problems, frankly. So
Yeah, and I guess shorebirds have pretty specific needs as far as, they need water, but not too deep, right? They need that shallow kind of muddy habitat is like at least for a lot of the species, that's their main need, right?
Yeah, well, it's not one thing that people, I think, miss. This is a good point to make, since you would, as a lot of people think if they've got the right depth of water that matters, but actually what's even more important is that there's food in the mud underneath the water. And one problem you see a lot of in Santa Barbara is we have a lot of places like Devereux Slough where the water, the nature of the habitat changes constantly. So if you look at somewhere like Devereux Slough, it has a fairly regular cycle where it will be extremely dry and hypersaline during the summer, probably from about June through until November, December. Then December it will suddenly fill up with fresh water. So then it will go from being hypersaline to fresh water. Then eventually, after 2 or 3 months with fresh water, it breaks out, and then it suddenly becomes tidal. And then about 3 weeks later, it will block up again, start becoming a bit more fresh water, and then it will break out again, become intertidal, and then finally it will block up again, become fresh water, and then progressively, as it dries out, hypersaline. So one of the problems you can imagine in that environment is that how many animals can survive being intertidal one moment, then fresh water the next, then in some dried out baked mud for 5 months, encrusted in salt and often a lot of golf balls from the old golf course upstream. And I think that's a thing I've noticed there, that when I've looked at the state of places like Devereux, typically for Devereux to be good for shorebirds, what tends to happen is you have to have the water cover all the mud, and the water's got to cover that mud for about 3 or 4 months. And once that's happened, then you get a food chain building up after about 3 months. And suddenly, once it drops, then there'll be masses of shorebirds there. But that type of thing happens very rarely. And to give you an example of what a difference can make, we had a year, this has only ever happened once in the history of Devereux since I've been here in 2006. I think it was 2006 or maybe in 2007. We had a situation where Devereux did not break out the whole winter, so it filled up with water. It was a very, very poor rainfall winter, so the slough filled with water, and then the water was there all winter and never ever went tidal, and it slowly dropped in the summer, and it didn't start exposing mud until August. And we had massive numbers of shorebirds. I'll just give you an example. There's a species called redneck phalarope, which is a type of shorebird that typically is mostly on the ocean offshore, but also will come onto coastal lagoons. And I'd say in a normal year, on a good day, you might see 20 or 30 redneck phalaropes there. Well, I think that autumn our high was 3,500 redneck phalaropes there. And so that autumn, I think we set almost every single maximum record of shorebird numbers there. And that's because we had a very, very stable habitat there for a whole year. And if you look at last summer, where which was last August was the first time Devereux has been good for shorebirds in fall for probably almost 10 years. And what happened again there is, and this is another, what happened there is that one way Devereux can get filled with water I didn't talk about was when the bar starts forming across the mouth in spring, you get these higher spring tides. They can actually push salt water over the bar into the lagoon, and they raise the water level up in the slough lagoon. And then what happened then was we had late rain. This time it was in May. When you get that late rain, all of a sudden you get, a chance of the slough to fill up again around May or June. And when that happens, then you've got water there for 3 months or so. And then again, when you come to August, it's dropped and exposed mud that's got a lot of stuff in it. You can always tell when there's good feeding in the lagoon, because what happens is the shorebirds will arrive and they'll stay there. So you'll get there and you'll see 10 red knots, for example, and they'll stay there a week because the feeding is so good they can just stay there and feed. Where if you go there in a year where there's no food in the mud, I've been cases where I've gone there every day, and sometimes you'll see a flock of yellowlegs and they drop in for 10 minutes and they're off because they realize, oh, this place sucks. And they're out of there trying to find somewhere better. So that's the biggest challenge in Santa Barbara is we don't really have stable habitat anywhere. I mean, Carpinteria salt marsh is probably the most stable place because that is pretty consistently intertidal, but even there it's mostly salt marsh.
Right.
And there's not very much intertidal mudflat, so it's not that good for shorebirds compared to a place that has big mudflat areas.
Well, you know, one of my dreams is that someday we might restore some of the parts of Carpinteria that used to be salt marsh that have been developed since then, or lightly developed with the State Beach Campground. And if someday we have an opportunity to reestablish a wetland there, maybe we can get you to weigh in on exactly how to manage it for maximum shorebird production.
Yeah, I mean, my general experience with wetland restoration in the US is pretty crappy. I mean, I got very, very cynical over the years because I just don't see that a lot of these restoration projects are managed properly, because people get very fixated, especially in California. They're very fixated on salt marsh because of things like ridge raised rails, which don't even occur here anyway and around Santa Barbara anymore.
Hey, Nick, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah.
But I'm mindful of the meeting time again.
Okay, sure. Well, let's get moving then.
Through the shorebirds. I am planning on doing a second meeting to talk about bigger shorebirds later, and if maybe I can get you back for that if you're still interested.
Sure.
And we can continue talking about this. This is all very fascinating to me, but again, I want to live up to the advertising and talk about the
right. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and launch the actual presentation. So if I've done this correctly, let's see, I'll unspotlight Nick. So if I've done this correctly, you should be seeing the big Peeps and Friends slide with a couple of least sandpipers on it. Is that what people are seeing? Okay,
yeah.
Excellent. So I'm just going to go ahead and step through this. And again, I'm going to go pretty fast and not talk in a lot of detail. But I just think shorebirds are great. And one thing I want to talk about is migration. They are the shorebird migration along the Pacific coast, the western coast of North America is one of the great spectacles of nature. And I'd love to be in a place that has a lot more appropriate shorebird habitat to see even more of it. But even the little bit of it that you can see here in Santa Barbara County is pretty exciting. And just to touch in really quickly on some of the features of the shorebird migration. And a lot of this information, by the way, I'm getting from one of my favorite shorebird books. So the Shorebird Guide by O'Brien, Crossley, and Carlson has a lot of great content on identifying shorebirds, and it's got all the different plumages represented for all the species you're likely to see. So I'm still learning from that, but it talks in brief about migration, and it talks about the fact that shorebird migration is a very high risk endeavor. That these birds travel thousands of miles every year, going north to the breeding grounds and then south to their wintering grounds. It's very risky and it's very energy intensive. It talks about the fact that during the migration, it's common for these shorebird species to lose 50% of their body weight. Like they have to, just chow down and get lots of stored fat, and then they're just off. And just a really amazing spectacle. And this risk that they incur and these costs that they incur, it's worth it because they're getting access to seasonally abundant food sources. They can use their mobility to go to a specific wetland that has really great resources at this time of year, and then be at another place thousands of miles away for another point in their life cycle. And also access to the breeding sites, especially up in the Arctic, up in the tundra, where there's lots of food for a few months of the year. There's a lot of food and relatively few predators. And they can go up there and breed and build up their populations and then head south before it all turns to snow and ice. And in this whole migration that they do, the stopover sites are really key. And it's definitely one of the major limitations of shorebird populations is whether they can find suitable habitat to refuel, to stop over. So the little bits of wetland that we have for shorebirds here in Santa Barbara County is very important to them. It's very important to those birds that use it, because even though they only spend maybe a few weeks out of the year there, it's crucial for their annual life cycle. And the migration they do is typically at night, typically at high altitude. They're up 20,000 feet up or more, and they're they're taking off in the evening and they just go, and it's, you're not going to see them traveling, but you go bird watch at a local estuary one day and you come in the next day and there's a whole different group of them there. So it's exciting stuff. And this is something I didn't really appreciate until recently. So it's kind of, there's a sequence to it. And this is something I would assume that Nick, you're very familiar with, that, during this fall migration starts happening now, you see different groups of, within one species, you'll see different groups at different times, or they'll overlap. But first you'll tend to see the subadult birds, or maybe the failed breeders. So these are birds that didn't get all the way up to the breeding grounds or didn't successfully breed there. You'll see them coming through first. Then you'll see the adult females, I guess, is the next big pulse, and then the adult males, and then finally the juveniles, the birds from this year. And as I said, there's a lot of overlap, and some of these birds hang around, like they get to a spot and maybe they stay there for a while they're molting, and then they continue, or maybe they actually winter in this area. But is that, and that's something that, up until now, I have not been as adept at distinguishing the different plumages and the different, when I look at a shorebird, I'm pretty happy if I can just get it to species and then I declare victory and kind of walk away. But, for someone who's actually more dialed into what they're looking at, you can distinguish between, oh, this is a juvenile bird, or this is an adult bird, and this is an adult bird that's starting its molt. And you get these very interesting things you can figure out about the different birds coming through. So that was all very general, but Nick, would you say that matches your experience, that you'd see different groups at different times? Like, I know you were talking about certain dates by which you'll see lots of juveniles there, and they're kind of overlapping.
Yeah, well, let me just make it. First thing is, I'd say one difference is that with subadults do not typically migrate all the way up to the breeding ground. So what happens is a lot of adult birds will just either stay on the wintering area, or they'll maybe migrate a short distance north. So one thing I've noticed, for example, around Galitas, we get greater yellowlegs. Suddenly, the main greater yellowlegs migration will be probably March and April, and then suddenly it drops off. And suddenly in mid-May, we'll get a pulse of these subadult birds. It's basically birds that are 1 year old, and they come up, hang around Devereux and Galita Slough, it seems, for a few weeks, and they then leave again. And so they're ones that don't even really go the full distance of migration, where things like, obviously I do agree, then you're going to get your failed breeders. So if you look at greater yellowlegs, we had this kind of, some arrive in May and then they mostly left by mid-June. A few hung around even longer, but now the actual failed breeders have started arriving in numbers. For example, I was up the Santa Ynez River yesterday, and I had some obvious many breeding adult greater yellowlegs had arrived, but and there was still a few of these subadults around, but we won't see the juveniles until sometime in August.
Yeah, so I guess it just takes them longer. They're building up, mass. They're growing. They're getting ready to make the journey, but they're not necessarily taking off right away. They're waiting till the last minute.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, I'm going to keep on going. So as I say, at least for me, especially historically, but still today, shorebird identification can be quite challenging. Usually these birds are off at a distance. It's hard to get close to them. So hopefully you've got a spotting scope, or if you have a big telephoto lens, you can get a decent look. But otherwise, you're talking about pretty distant views. And they tend to look pretty similar. There are differences, and the more I study them, the more I come to appreciate those differences. But it can be tough if you're just trying to match pictures in the field guide. It's like, well, they all look like this. What am I looking at here? So there's some strategies that are helpful, and I want to talk about those really briefly. So one is location and date. So if you go into the process knowing what shorebirds are supposed to be there at the current spot you're at, and location, geographically, and also location in terms of habitat, and the particular time of year, again, because they're so migratory, they tend to be there certain times and very much not there other times. That can be super helpful. You can winnow it down to just a fairly small number of candidates you have to pick between. And it's true that with this big migration that they do, you do get a fair amount of vagrancy. When they cover thousands of miles, especially the first year birds, it doesn't take much for one of them to kind of get off course and end up in the wrong place. So there are these exciting, exceptions to the expected birds that you'll see out there, but they're going to be in very small numbers. It's going to be ones or maybe two of those, and then hundreds of the expected ones. So again, if you go into it knowing what the expected ones are, it can be a lot easier to figure out what you're looking at. And then the next thing to think about, and this is sort of in the hierarchy of the things I try to do as I'm trying to figure out a bunch of shorebirds I'm looking at. So besides knowing what is expected there, there's comparative size and structure. So you really want to, you want an idea of how big is this bird you're looking at, because if the pattern on a lot of them is kind of the same, the size and things like the beak structure and the body shape can be really helpful in distinguishing them. And, it's always the problem when you're trying to identify birds at a distance that you don't really know how big they are. Like you can get a sense for how big you think they are, but unless there's a yardstick, unless they're perched right next to something of known size, it can be hard. But this is actually where shorebird behavior is really useful, because they do tend to form mixed flocks and hang out together. So in this photo, if you look, it's kind of hard to see, but maybe you can see right here, this is a larger shorebird with a white throat and belly with two big broad black bands across it. Well, that's a pretty distinctive bird. Like, even as a bird who's not that experienced, you can recognize that that's a killdeer. So now you've got a yardstick, right? Now there's a bird of known size that's there with all these other birds, and you can get a much better sense of how big are those other birds. So if you can identify some of them, they can be a key that helps you unlock the other ones. And then behavior, and I'm going to talk in just a minute, I'm going to show a slide of a David Sibley illustration I thought was really neat that kind of illustrates different feeding styles. But again, because all these different species hang out in kind of the same area, they all have evolved to exploit different niches. So they have different feeding styles, they have different beak lengths, and they have different manners of probing for food. And as you learn that, it really helps distinguish between them. Voice, if you can hear them, can be super helpful. Certainly for some of them, like I'm still, like if I can't hear a group of dowitchers, I'm very likely to just put them in as long billed / short billed. I don't, they're dowitchers. I'm not confident that I can distinguish them. But if they're vocalizing, it gets a lot easier. So, if you can hear the birds, that's helpful. And then, pattern and field marks, kind of where, back in my early days of birding, this is kind of what I started with. But again, if you go through all these other things first, by the time you get to trying to match it to the pictures in the field guide, you're way ahead of the game. And then finally, for the really tricky ID, you're really talking about very fine grained, plumage details. And hopefully if you're close enough to them, or you can get a good photo, good light behind you, illuminating the bird well, then you can start to look at things like the state of feather wear, and that helps you figure out the molt status. And then you can start talking about, oh, it's a juvenile bird, or it's an adult that's midway through its molt into its winter plumage, or and this is all really fascinating. And I'm sure if I asked Nick to start talking about it, we'd talk the rest of the time about it. But I'm just learning it, and but that's basically where I'm at in terms of trying to learn this stuff. That's like the final frontier. And if we can get to the end, there's a couple of species that I definitely want to raise my game so I have a chance of identifying them in the field. So here's that David Sibley thing I was talking about. I'm just going to go through it pretty quick. But these are 4 different shorebirds, and they're not to scale. He sort of reproduced them all at similar sizes. But in the upper left, that's a generic peep, a small sandpiper. And as it travels along, it basically goes along and it dips its beak down and probes a little bit, and goes and dips and probes a little bit. So that's its feeding style. Over in the upper right, this is a yellow legs. So it has more of a, like it's in deeper water, and it tends to dip its head way down and do some probing, and then go along and do some dip way down and do some probing. Lower left here, these are dowitchers, and they're like the sort of sewing machine style. They're just foraging by feel, like 100% just what they can probe with their beak. They're not really using their eyes at all for that. And they're just down there, constantly going like this the whole time. And then finally, plovers in the lower right-hand corner here, they're visual hunters. So they have kind of bigger eyes proportionally than most other shorebirds. And they're usually not in the water, but maybe out a little bit on the edge where it's drier. And they're looking for prey, and they'll see something and they'll run and stop and grab it, and they'll run and stop and look and run and stop. And that sort of characteristic plover behavior is something you can key in on pretty quickly. And we are going to look, as I go now into the actual species, we'll look at some small plovers that are, at least from a distance to a casual view, they're sort of superficially similar to some of the peeps, the other kinds of small shorebirds, but that behavior is very different, and it's easy to distinguish them once you start looking at that. So before I go on though, Nick, please correct anything really horribly wrong that I've said here.
The one thing I'd say is that you mentioned that the shorebirds are often, you have to look at them a long way away. I'd actually say that most shorebirds are actually extremely confiding, especially smaller ones. If you actually get to a place, you can walk up to them. So if you're a beginner who wants to start looking at shorebirds, I'd say that the beach around Coal Point, especially the beach just east of Coal Point at low tide, if you go there fairly early in the morning before it's too disturbed, you can often get very, very close looks at plovers and peeps and godwits and things like that. It's fairly, and also it's very predictable what shorebirds are there. There's always about the same 10 to 12 species with not much variety. So it's a good place to go where you can know what you're going to see and learn some of these basic groups.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great advice. I will be there soon. Okay, so now I'm going to go through some specific species, and I've broken them down into a few groups. So first I'm going to look at some small plovers that we have here in Santa Barbara County. Two of them, the snowy plover and the semipalmated plover. And then this is the eBird histogram that we look at in a lot of these meetings. So basically, the thickness of the green boxes is what percentage of eBird lists this species shows up in Santa Barbara County for that week in the year. So you see snowy plovers we have pretty much throughout the year, a little bit of a thickening in the fall, but pretty steady otherwise. Semipalmated plover, again, we have them throughout the year, but a bigger uptick in their numbers in the fall as the birds that breed elsewhere in North America are sort of funneling down through the area. You see them distributed more. Okay, so here is a species. I do have vocalizations I've taken from Zeno Canto. So let's see if I've done this correctly. I don't remember if I shared this with audio. I think I did. So tell me if you can hear this. This is a recording of this species by Paul Marvin. It's not very loud, but hopefully you could hear that. That may just be the recording that's not that loud. So this is the snowy plover. And, in terms of field marks, I mean, they're going to be on the beach. They're breeding up there at Coal Oil Point. They're very light, very light tan. They blend in with the sand really well because that's what they're doing. They're hanging out on the sand. It's got that plover beak, kind of a, a relatively long, thin, dark plover beak compared to the next species we're going to look at, and an incomplete band typically. So they have sort of that ring, but it doesn't go all the way across the breast. Anything else, like Nick, that you particularly would point out to people in terms of identifying snowy plovers?
No, not really. It's a pretty easy species. It's very pale above that. So there's basically snowy plovers and sandling are the two things on the beach. They're that very, very pale color above.
Yeah. Here's the eBird sightings map. So this is, blue pins wherever it's been reported in Santa Barbara County, and then red pins where it's been reported in the last 30 days. And you see they're almost exclusively along the coast. You're not seeing them inland. This cluster of red pins is again at Coal Oil Point, and I think that's Devereaux or maybe North Campus open space. They've got some snowy plover habitat they've created there. But they're up there breeding now, and they're adorable, and you respect the fencing that keeps people out of their breeding areas, but you can go up there and get really good looks at them right now. And they have, they've shown up along Carpinteria's beach. There was a failed breeding attempt, I think, on the beach in front of the salt marsh. And, they're around down here, and presumably if the breeding program, because they're an endangered subspecies, the Western snowy plover, and they're actively, folks are actively working on helping them recover. As they recover, they may expand their breeding territory. It's conceivable they might, try breeding down here. We don't really have the really good habitat for them, but with luck at some point, maybe we can get some breeding down here too. And then outside the breeding season, you can definitely see them, they expand down here, and you can see them. And then here's the other small plover we'll talk about. Here is a recording of it made by William Whitehead. And this is the semi-palmated plover. So about the same size as the snowy plover, but a lot darker. You know, it's got that dark brown upper parts, complete black band most of the time. And then the beak has that little bit of yellow on it. You know, it's sort of a shorter, stubbier plover style beak. I guess the legs are yellower. Is that typical, Nick, that they have more of the
Yeah,
the yellow
definitely.
stuff?
I mean, the Semipalmated Plover is really has orange on the bill base and orangey yellow legs, whereas snowy plover is basically black billed, and its legs are kind of typically a nondescript, pale grayish type color, often sometimes blackish even, but they're never orange really on a snowy plover.
Yeah. And so here's their sightings locations in eBird. Again, a lot of them up there at Coal Oil Point and, you know, sort of the west side of UCSB along the coast. There's a little more occurrences inland if you can get suitable habitat. You know, they have them at, I guess they've been reported at Lake Kachuma and some other places, but still pretty much along the coast is the best place to see them. All right, I'm gonna move on to the next group. And these are just some that I threw in here. They're not technically peeps. They're a little too big for peeps, but they're smallish shorebirds and, you know, certainly potentially confusable with peeps if you're birding quickly. So I think they're fun to talk about. So first is the Sanderling, which you can see from the eBird sightings histogram we have pretty much throughout the year. A little bit of a, you know, dip right during the breeding window there, but other than that, we tend to have them pretty much most of the time. And then Baird, Sandpiper, really the fall, like right about now on into the next, you know, few months is your opportunity to see, you know, a few of those coming through on their fall journey south. All right, so here is one, and let's see. Here's a recording by Stanislaus Rosa of this species. And this is a Sanderling. So with this, I mean, I'm curious, Nick, you know, as I'm trying to get into being more specific in identifying not just the species, but age and sex, can you identify what, you know, can you age this bird? Can you sex this bird? Do you have any sensors other than it's a Sanderling?
Well, I wouldn't be able to sex it, but it's clearly in molt. The question is, I'm trying to work out, is it molting from, I think it's actually molting probably from, yeah, it must be, it's molting from summer to winter plumage.
Okay.
So you'll see that a lot of the feathers, you can see quite a lot of reddish type feathering and blackish spotting, you know, and then you see these newer feathers coming in that are black with a lot more white on them and some gray coming in on the back. That plain gray coming on the back is,
Like up in here?
yeah, it's clearly where the winter plumage is coming in.
Yeah, cool. Okay, and then
And
here's,
this is obviously an adult bird, and there's a
Yeah.
winter plumage one there.
Yeah.
That's
And this
got
one's
rid
like-
of all that stuff.
and this is a really light one. Like I'm used to seeing with maybe a little more gray than this in the winter, but I like this because it kind of illustrated that whole range of variation. They can go from, you know, relatively dark in some plumages to a really light looking bird like this. But yeah, and they're, you know, they're a little bigger than peeps. The beak is, you know, black, pretty straight, fairly thick, you know, relatively speaking for a shorebird beak. Black legs. And then the big thing that makes them easy to pick out is the behavior. So Sanderlings are like always doing their aerobics. They're always like running up and down the beach. So they're basically foraging at the edge of the water where there's some wave action, and a whole flock of them, you know, chase the receding wave out and then pick at the sand and then run back away from the wave as it comes in again. Is it, and you sometimes do see peeps, like I've seen Western sandpipers on the beach, but I'm curious, Nick, do you ever see like other non-Sanderlings kind of doing that same kind of thing where there's just a bunch of them running down and back as the waves are moving?
Not typically, no.
Yeah.
One other kind of fun point that you can actually see in these pictures is Sanderlings don't have a hind toe on their feet, whether some of the various, and all the other peeps do have some type of hind toe, though it's not very obvious in a lot of them, but the lack of a hind toe is actually a classic Sanderling kind of it's not really something you use really in the field because they're so obvious, but there's a well-known difference between them and most other calidrid shorebirds.
Cool.
Calidrids being the generic name for sandlings and peeps and dunlins, that they're all called calidrid.
That genus.
Yeah.
Okay, here's their occurrence. So currently, again, you want to see some of these shorebirds, this is the time to go out to Coal Oil Point and is it called Sands Beach, just west of there, and some of the other beaches around there. Although, certainly we've seen them down here around Carpinteria too. Just, I think maybe we're not getting quite as much birder activity down here, and maybe that's why we're not getting some red pins there.
Yeah, there's typically as many as it varies, but there's typically about 200 to 400 sandlings wintering around Coal Oil Point. Now, right now is not a good time to see them because sandlings are very, very high Arctic breed. It breeds right up in the Canadian Arctic islands. So it's the last shorebird cowrie to leave. And then it doesn't typically get back until around the end of July. We should see the first returning adults. So it's quite a bit later than some of the other shorebirds because it breeds so much further north.
Yeah, and then we'll get like really, again, we'll get big numbers of them as we get into the fall, right there, as they're just moving through.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, and then this species, which is really fun. Let's see. I have a recording of this one, vocalizing by Paul Marvin. And this is the Baird Sandpiper, the one that we saw just, yeah, Rob, you had something to say?
I'm just wondering, are most of these vocalizations heard on the breeding grounds? Because I don't hear any of these regularly around here.
Well, I would defer to Nick's opinion on that. Like, I just grabbed sort of interesting sounding, recordings. I wasn't necessarily filtering them based on that. So I, don't want to mislead people that they're going to be hearing these sounds. I certainly don't know these vocalizations on this species. I've only seen it a few times, so I don't really know what it sounds like.
Yeah, I would say generally you're playing the typical flight note calls of these birds, but it may be that they were taken on the breeding grounds. So there's some extra noise kicked in, like on the sandling. The other things that maybe like a flock of sandlings they record, then it becomes a so many ones going tweet, 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 tweet. It's hard to actually make out the individual call, but you're generally playing the flight calls, and those are often very useful. That it can get tricky at some of these species, like Baird Sandpiper, for example, and Pectoral Sandpiper sound extremely similar to me, and I can't tell them apart. The flight calls myself.
Yeah. So again, with the Baird Sandpiper, the field, the characteristics that I would be looking for is this very elongated body shape, right? They're long distance migrants, even compared to other shorebirds, and the primaries, the wings are very long, and the primaries extend out past the end of the tail, and that plus their basic body plan just gives them this very elongated, kind of attenuated shape that's really noticeable. They have this relatively straight, thick sandpiper type beak, and then this very scaly pattern. And I'm not sure if that's just in the case of the juveniles or if the adults look that way too. Certainly the ones I've seen were very scaly on top, on the back, and the scapulars and this area of the bird, and black legs. So you put all that together, and they're a little bit larger than your typical peeps, but not a lot. They're pretty small. The few times I've seen them, that's what really jumped out at me. Any other hints you want to offer, Nick, if someone wants to see a Baird Sandpiper?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. One is in Santa Barbara County, it's almost always juveniles. I don't think I've ever seen an adult in the autumn. I've seen one adult in spring, and then dozens of juveniles over the autumns, but never an adult. So you don't really need to worry that much about adults here.
Yeah. And
And
that's
then-
sort of typical of vagrancy, right? Because again, it's the first year birds that don't really know where they're going that are more prone to wandering off to a place like Santa Barbara.
Yeah,
which
I
is
also
often
think
a-
some of these shorebirds have somewhat slightly different migration strategies as juveniles they do as adults. At least both petrel and Baird sandpipers, their juveniles migrate over a much broader front than the adults do.
Mhm.
Even more so in petrel. But another thing about Bairds is that they're kind of fairly brownish and buffish. So when you see them, you're not going to see a lot of gray. You see that scaly appearance in the head. That, by the way, is a least sandpiper you're pointing at there.
Oh,
So if we
wait,
get back to the Bairds here,
wait, this one
the
in the
head
front
is kind of fairly, it's a kind of fairly buffy brown on the head and the breast.
so you're saying this one on the left is a least over here?
Yeah, that's the least, I believe. It's definitely not a Bairds, that's for sure.
Okay, yeah.
I'd need to get a better look. It might be a Western even, but without getting a better look, it's hard to tell. It's hard to say.
Okay.
And then in terms of looking for Bairds, Bairds are what they tend to like. There's a few good places. They definitely, not that you want to drive all the way there unless you're a fanatic like me, but they definitely like the Santa Maria sewage ponds is a pretty good place for them. And then the other thing, Bairds often quite like sandy beaches where they'll feed not low down by the ocean, but they feed it in the rack line where you've got, kelp and seaweed along that rack line. That's often the place that Baird sandpipers like. So you can find them on sandy beaches. Again, like Color Point, they're typically not, that's not a place to expect to see them, but if you were, say, going there 20 times in an autumn looking, you probably eventually find one or two Baird sandpipers.
Yeah.
One other thing,
Yeah.
I digress a bit, but what happens with shorebirds is that because they nest in the Arctic, there's a correlation typically between numbers of shorebirds and the lemming season. So in a good lemming year up there, all the Arctic foxes and Jaegers and stuff are eating lemmings. Where what happens in a year with and that in those kind of years, the shorebird chicks they all grow up to be, and you get these big years where there's lots and lots of juvenile shorebirds, and you'll have a big migration. And you'll get other years where shorebird productivity is way down, and then you'll see many fewer. So there's big annual fluctuations often in the number of species like Baird sandpipers and petrels and stuff coming through Santa Barbara, depending on how good the breeding season was.
Cool. Yeah, I had no idea that relationship existed. Okay, so here's eBird sightings ever for Baird sandpipers. You can see it's not a lot of locations, but cluster here in Western Santa Barbara and Goleta area, a few in Carpinteria, a few up here at probably Ocean Beach Park area, Santa Ynez River Estuary, and then up here also at Santa Maria River Estuary, and then a few other spots inland. So you got, and up here, and I think they were up at the new Kuyama waste treatment pond up there in Kuyama last year. So if you watch eBird, you'll see reports of them, and you can go chase after them and try and see one. Okay, so now we can do Peeps proper. So we've made it to Peeps. So I appreciate everybody, sticking with me for this long. But here are the actual Peeps I'm going to talk about. And two species mainly of Peeps that we see in Santa Barbara County, the least sandpiper that we see most of the year with just a little dip when they're actually almost all up there breeding in the Arctic. But then in pretty good numbers, in the fall and decent numbers the rest of the year we have them. And then Western sandpipers, which again, we have them throughout the year, but the big pulse is in the fall as the year's Western sandpipers are moving down along the Pacific coast. And then just a very small number of sightings of semi-palmated sandpiper. And my ulterior motive for asking Nick to be at this meeting is so I can pick his brain about like identification strategies for semi-palmated sandpiper, because that is a bird I've never identified and I would love to be able to. But it's challenging for me. So we'll go on and we'll look at these species. So most of these, I'm doing some comparisons here just to kind of give you a side-by-side look at the two species that we have a lot of. So let's see, I'll just go ahead and reveal the names. So here's your least sandpiper on the left and your Western sandpiper on the right. And these are sort of your, what I think of as sort of their winter plumage look, their kind of, you know, grayer look that they get. But the real, the big field mark that was certainly the first thing I learned to look for is the leg color. You know, the leaf sandpiper, if the light is right and you're close enough, you can see it has these yellowish, greenish yellow legs. And the western sandpiper has very black legs. And then another thing to look for structurally is the beak. Now there's some range of variation, but generally your western sandpiper has a longer, droopier beak, and your leaf sandpiper has a shorter beak with I'm not even sure how to describe it really, but a leaf sandpiper's beak tends to be sort of pointier in a way, and the western sandpiper's beak tends to be sort of more bulbous towards the tip. You know, the way I think of it is like, I feel like if I took a leaf sandpiper and poked its beak at me, it would hurt more. Whereas if I took a western sandpiper and poked its beak at me, it would be a little blunter. It wouldn't quite have the same effect. And then there's, you know, there's other differences, but those are certainly what you can start with.
John, I'd actually like to kind of disagree with you a little bit
Oh,
here.
please.
So,
Yeah, excellent.
while certainly leg color is very useful, it does get people into trouble because these legs can get dirty and muddy.
Yes.
And so you can get situations where at least it's got dark mud on the legs where it looks black legged, and more rarely you might have a western sandpiper with caked mud that's got pale.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then also at long range, it gets hard to see the leg color. And there is a pretty big general difference. If you look at the bird if you look at that, firstly, that one problem with this western sandpiper on the right, it's already starting to molt into breeding plumage by the looks of it. But
Yeah.
if you take western sandpipers are much whiter below, you'll see the least has a dirty, dusky throat and breast,
Here. Yep.
where the western sandpiper is brilliantly, you know, bright white. And also then it's also pale gray above, not dirty brown. So a western sandpiper in winter plumage looks basically pale gray and white, where a least looks like dirty, yucky brown with, you know, less white.
Yeah. Yeah, those are all excellent points. Some of which I knew, some of which are new to me, and I'll do my best to remember. But thank you for pointing that out. In fact, I have an example later of a leaf sandpiper with muddy legs that caused me some. I was very proud of myself at the time because I recognized it as a leaf sandpiper despite it having the muddy legs. But who knows how many times I've failed to notice that was leading me the wrong way. So here's another pair of birds, and these are more in the breeding type plumage, or at least the you know, one with the more rufous kind of highlights. Again, this is a western sandpiper on the right and a leaf sandpiper on the left. Not sure. I guess I am curious, Nick, if you look at this bird on the right, so is this a juvenile western sandpiper?
These are both juvenile birds.
Okay,
yeah.
Excellent. And that's like you can kind of see that the scapulars and the coverts and the primary, I mean the tertials, and these are all kind of the same age, right? They all have kind of those
Yes.
fluffy edges, so they're all relatively new feathers.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So I'm learning.
And
so
again, if you look at these two birds, other than the obvious structural features that John talked about structure earlier, and notice you can see the hind toe and stuff on that western sandpiper.
Yeah, right there.
Again, you see the western sandpiper is much whiter and cleaner on the breast, so they can have a peachy wash. But if you look on the least, it's got that extensive streak breast band right across the breast.
Yeah, right through.
So again, if you look, that's a good feature at long range. If you see a small peep and it's got a heavily, obviously streaked breast right across, that's typically going to be a least, where a western will have just the streaking will be limited to the sides of the breast with either a peachy wash or just a plain white breast in the juveniles, that is.
Yeah, and certainly this western has a noticeably longer, droopier beak. I was reading, I guess, that the female western sandpipers have longer beaks than the males typically.
Yeah, and unfortunately western sandpipers have very variable bill lengths, and it can be quite tricky on some of the short-billed birds to work out whether they're westerns or not.
Okay, so now let's see. I've got the recording of this species. Now we're going on. I'm past the comparisons and I'm just doing this species. So here's some flight calls, I think, of this species. And these are, of course, least sandpipers. So yeah, so I'd be curious. So Nick, what do you think we're looking at here in terms of aging this bird?
To me, it looks like an adult in breeding plumage that's starting to molt, probably just starting to molt to winter plumage. And definitely the bird on the right is definitely a molting adult. You can see it's all those new feathers coming in, the warm ones coming out, as we got that patchy appearance.
Yeah, and you can
Plus,
see like
also, by the way, I mean, I'm cheating a bit because it says July, so generally at that there won't be that many juvenile lease coming through until the very end of July, but they wouldn't have this kind of manky appearance these birds have.
And compared to
the much crisper and cleaner.
Yeah, and the ones we looked at earlier, like, they had these fresh feathers down here at the lower edge of the wing. And here you see these are kind of older and the edges are kind of worn and All right, so here's the sightings map for least sandpiper. You can see they occur inland a fair amount, right? They, if you have any little patch of shallow water with suitable habitat, there's a decent chance of finding a least sandpiper in various places around the county.
Yeah, just one point to add is that I thought those eBird graphs were a little bit deceptive. That Western sandpiper is really not very common at all in winter in the county. So, for example, around Goleta, we maybe on a Santa Barbara Christmas bird count will typically have 0 to like 5 birds. There's almost always 2 or 3 birds around, but there's not big numbers in Santa Barbara. I don't think they're that particularly common in Carpinteria salt marsh in winter either, if my memory serves me right.
Yeah, and the eBird data, has quality issues depending on what aspect of it you're looking at, and people are reporting it is what it's saying, but if they don't have photos or it's not always like, I know you're one of the regional reviewers for eBird because you've corrected many of my misidentifications, which I very much appreciate. But with a species that is one that occurs there, it's less likely to trip the filters, or less, if there isn't like photographic documentation, there's not really a way for a reviewer to say, right, did they actually misidentify a least sandpiper?
I think we do have the filter limit set quite low on Western sandpiper now, so we would just the point I want to stress is that you're generally going to see no more than a handful of Western sandpipers in winter, where least sandpiper there are probably hundreds wintering in the county. So least sandpiper is essentially 2 orders of magnitude commoner than Western sandpiper in winter. But in spring migration and fall migration, Western sandpiper is commoner than least, often much so.
Cool. Yeah, like you've had those really big flocks of them you've been reporting in the last few weeks, like out at Ocean Beach Park. All right, so here's my great white whale, or my tiny little buffy whale. This is oh, sorry, no, this is the Western sandpiper. I thought we were already to the semi-palmated. Clearly, I am in no state to identify these birds accurately. Now here's our Western sandpiper, and so is this a juvenile bird we're looking at here? Probably. Yeah,
it's a juvenile. You can see very clean edges to all the coverts, that kind of stuff, and scapulars.
Yeah, and something I was reading in the shorebird guide too is that I guess that juvenile plumage, the coverts and the scapulars are smaller, right? You get those larger feathers in the adults in this area of the bird, whereas the juvenile ones, they tend to be kind of smaller feathers. Is that something you've noticed? Or?
I personally don't know that, but it may be true. But I've actually never noticed that or read about it. But I'll take it. I'll take it you're correct, and it seems like it might well be correct. Yeah.
So certainly in this one, you could see it's got the nice, black legs, or at least what appear to be black legs, and that kind of Western sandpiper beak, as opposed to that least sandpiper pointier kind of beak. And this little stripe of the reddish color seems like a really, something that shows up at a distance and really you can quickly kind of separate it from the other small peeps you might be seeing it with. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, certainly the rufous edges to the scapulars is an important feature. Least sandpipers do show that a bit, but not to the extent of western. And there's, again, they're a pretty different looking bird to western sandpipers. So
Right, here's the eBird sightings map for western sandpipers currently. And all right, so here's my little buffy whale. This is the semi-palmated sandpiper, and it's so the things that I've kind of been reading up on that I want to look for when I'm looking for this bird is the beak is relatively short and straight, and so it's, you know, this definitely, I mean, I guess there are western sandpipers whose beaks could get down into this range, but in general, you're thinking, you know, if you see a semi-palmated sandpiper, it's going to have a beak that's relatively short like this.
yeah, they vary a bit. I mean, for the perspective of Santa Barbara County, they would typically have a short, stubby-ended bill like this. If you go to the East Coast, there are actually ones that look like western sandpipers, long curved beaks. And it's really tricky there. I remember I got such a shock when I arrived there, and you just couldn't feel, you felt like you couldn't identify anything.
And you're just surrounded by semi-palmated sandpipers out there, right? I mean, they're
yeah, but just a lot of them look like western, so because, or at least they have the bill similar to western sandpiper. But this is a pretty classic semi-palmated, short, straight, blunt beak, and that's what the ones in Santa Barbara County will look like.
Okay. And here, you know, again, a juvenile bird, which is what we're likely to see if we see a semi-palmated, right, with this fresh plumage, and a very kind of scaly back pattern that does not really have a distinct rufous feature, right? It's got some rufous edging, but it isn't like that distinctive rufous area that the
yeah, well,
western
typically
has.
in semi-palmated, there's a kind of a gingery orange edging, as you can see here.
Yeah.
So they have edging, but it's thinner and it's gingery and orange. It's not thicker and rufous.
Yeah, and then this.
I know that may sound like splitting hairs, but basically it's rufous on western and kind of a gingery orange on semi-palmated. Typically, though, very rarely semi-palmated can have rufous there, but it's always thinner than it is on a western. Another thing to look for, if you look on this one, you'll see that there's, if you look at the scapulars and coverts, the black centers are more extensive on semi-palmated. If you flip back to the western picture,
This one?
yeah, you'll see that they're kind of like the black. The black is not quite as extensive in the scapulars and coverts.
Yeah.
There's more gray showing. So you don't get quite such a dark, scaly appearance on the westerns you do on the semi-palmated.
Yeah. And then this sort of buffy area in the throat and upper breast, is that something you can look for too, or is that just this individual bird?
That's just varies per bird. I mean, a lot of westerns will look like that. Now, one thing that I don't know if we can't see it quite as well here, but there's generally a difference in head pattern. That semi-palmated sandpipers have a more heavily dark streak crown, and they have a sort of darker cheek area, and the supercilium is a little bit more prominent. So they have a more contrasting head pattern typically than western.
Yeah, I've seen that talked about too.
And maybe if you flip back, we can see if it's valid here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we could say it. It's a bit difficult as the lights are, but you can probably see at least the kind of area below the eye here is pretty pale on this bird, and it's not. Where if you look at the semi-palmated picture, I think you'll see that whole area is just generally slightly darker and more contrasty. It's a subtle feature, but it's often quite obvious.
Yeah, yeah. Rob, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, just a little anecdote. I lived on the East Coast most of my life. When I first moved out here and started birding out here, I reported a flock of 150 semi-palmated sandpipers on eBird, and the reviewer quickly jumped down my throat on that one.
Yeah, it's, I'm sure, a lonely, thankless job for the eBird reviewer. And that's the thing too, like birders who go to a new location, from what I understand from like reading up on the review process, are just like notoriously, sources of that kind of error, because, like I do it myself. I go someplace else and I hear something and I think, oh, that's this, because back where I bird at home, when I hear that something I just heard, it is that. But in this other location, maybe there's 2 or 3 different species that sound the same way that I don't have at home. And visually the same thing happens. I go into it with just this mental, this mental map of what's out there, and I start matching things to my mental map. But if my map is not accurate for the current location, I can be misidentifying left and right. So it's hard to keep that in mind. But yeah, it definitely is a thing. Okay, well, I'm going to zip forward a little bit, see what else we have. So here's semi-palmated sightings. Not too many in Santa Barbara County. So Nick, you are responsible for the one red pin, the one sighting in the last 30 days. This was your sighting out at the Santa Ynez River mouth. Is that a place you would suggest someone go if they were obsessively seeking to see a semi-palmated sandpiper?
Well, to be honest, no, and a few reasons why. One is that you need to be close to these shorebirds to identify them.
Yeah.
And the Santa Ynez River is very difficult to get close to shorebirds. I do have an advantage. I actually have a Vandenberg Air Force base pass, so I can actually get to places on the river that normal birders can't. Now, even with that access, it's still difficult. But for example, that bird I saw there's no way you'd see it without base. You'd not have seen it without base access because it's way up the river. And so generally you want to be somewhere you're pretty close to the birds, not a long way away. And also that particular red dot is it was an adult, and I suspect I've seen a adult there probably about 3 times in the last 5 or 6 years in late June or early July. I suspect it's the same bird that's got the habit of dropping by there. Yeah. As I said, the place that used to be by far the best place, especially for inexperienced birders to go, was the Goleta Sanitary District, and that was formerly a very reliable place for semi-palmated sandpipers. Now, of course, right now you can't even go there at all because it's shut because of COVID. But the other problem, they had a management change here, and they're generally keeping the water levels higher on the lagoons, so there's not much shorebird habitat. So I would tend to say, if I had to look for a semi-palmated sandpiper now, I'd go to the San Maria sewage ponds, which is obviously a really long drive for me and even longer for in Carpinteria.
So that'd be basically up here, is that?
Yeah, but that at least you can drive around there and you're close to, you can get fairly close to birds. You still would need a telescope, but with a scope you can generally get good looks at everything because the ponds aren't that big.
Yeah.
So you're not with the Santa Ynez River mouth. The problem there is that you're almost always, it seems like, with most of the time you're like 100 yards plus away or 100 from the birds. It's really difficult.
Yeah, it's
like so everything's on the edge of identifiability if you're really good like me. And if you're trying to learn these things, you don't want to be staring at stuff a long way away. It's just not fun.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why I have not reported one up till now, and it's because I could well have seen one in a group of 150 shorebirds, but yeah, I wasn't confident.
Yeah, I mean, for example, last year I had one at Devereux, and Devereux was, again, I said, was good last August. I was able to find one bird there. They do have a different call to Western sandpipers.
Oh yeah, so I do have a recording. Let me play that. So
it's a deeper call.
So I've got 2 examples of semi-palmated sandpiper. Here's a recording by Paul Marvin, and I don't know which one this is. And then here's another one.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if that's either fighting birds or if they're from the breeding grounds.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't record that info.
Noise.
Yeah. Anyway, well, I appreciate all this time devoted to semi-palmated sandpiper, but I'm gonna zip ahead because there's just a few more slides I wanted to show. So I've got sort of some fun stuff at the end to just kind of put what we've learned to use and look at some photos. So these are like quiz photos. So this will not be difficult for Nick, but I certainly encourage people to look at these, and given what we've talked about, what do people think we're looking at here? You got a couple of shorebirds, both of them were talked about today. Can we get someone willing to volunteer and go out there and suggest what they think these are? I can only see a few thumbnails, so I'm not sure if you're raising your hand, I might not see it. All right, well, if I don't hear no takers, all right, Rob, you put your hand up. Thank you, Rob.
I'm looking at the lower bird, and I'm seeing a Western Sandpiper beak on a least Sandpiper.
Yeah, so this is why it's tricky, right?
Droopy beak.
Yeah, the beak is kind of droopy, but the yellow legs and the darker plumage pattern probably is a good hint. And then up here, of course, this is our semi-palmated plover with the orange legs and the kind of shorter, stubbier plover beak. So yeah, semi-palmated plover and a least Sandpiper. All right, so here's a bad photo, which I apologize because I took this photo. But, bad photos reflect like, the viewing conditions are not always ideal. Maybe you can see bad, viewing conditions. So this is reflective of what's out there in the field. So anyone want to take a guess at what we've got here?
I think the bottom one is the least.
That is exactly right, Brody. Yeah, we got a least on the bottom, and then the others are all Western Sandpipers. So yeah, good call. So this is the one I wanted to try and trick people with, but I already kind of spoiled the trick by mentioning that I had this later. So this is at the Goleta Sanitary District. And there was this whole flock of these and they were real close to me and I was getting great views. I'm like, man, their legs are totally the wrong color. Because this is a least Sandpiper, but it looks like it has black legs, but it's just walking in black muck that is all over its legs. And in that same group, there was another one that I got this photo. You can see a little bit of its actual leg color there at the top of its leg, but otherwise it's just all coated in black. So yeah, so you can't just go by that leg color. You really want to take all the clues into account when you're looking at your peeps to try and figure out what you're looking at. All right, and this one was fun. So this was I don't know if anybody is into bird Twitter, but Tricky Bird ID is what Jason Ward does on Twitter. This game he runs periodically, and this was one of the photos in Tricky Bird ID. I played this game and I got these wrong, so I felt bad about that. But now I could do better if I did it again today. So there actually are two different species here. Anyone want to take a guess? I see Jenny and Craig are discussing this with their mic muted, so we can't hear what they're saying. Brody, what do you think we have here?
I think the top ones are the least Sandpipers, and then the bottom one is the Western.
You are exactly right. That is how it was identified in the game. A couple of least Sandpipers and a Western. So good job, Brody. Maybe you should get on Twitter and play Tricky Bird ID. But you got to be fast. That's the hard thing about Tricky Bird ID. There's like, 200 people playing, so only the first 3 people with correct answers get to score points. So it's very challenging and you got to go fast. You don't really have time to consult your field guide. All right, well, that is it for the slides. I don't know if anybody has any follow-up. I appreciate that people stuck with me through a pretty long meeting here, especially Nick, who showed up and let me pester him with more questions than I've been able to pester him with up till now. Any commentary from people? Any feedback? Final word about Peeps before we put Peeps to bed?
Still fun, John.
Peeps are still fun. Peeps are a lot of fun. Okay, well, thank you everybody for showing up and participating in the meeting. And we will not have a meeting next week, but we will have one the following Thursday at 4 p.m. I'm cautiously thinking I'll do bigger shorebirds, so we get all the shorebirds wrapped up, at one time. If you're sick of shorebirds, send me an email and I'll consider doing something else. But for now, that's what I'm planning to do. So thank you, everybody, and I will see you next time in 2 weeks.
Thanks, John.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks, John. Thank you.